Hello and welcome to Hey, I Like, the podcast where we talk about all the things that make our neurodivergent brains go bonkers. I am your host, Jess, and I am joined today by my lovely friend to talk about a very, very cool topic. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners at home?
Hello, I am Tom. I am here to talk about Tolkien.
Yay!
Oh, Tolkien is so great. I have so much to say about Tolkien.
We'd better get started then.
Yes.
Where to begin?
Yes. There is so much to say. So, I think, first of all, we gotta talk about just how crazy influential Tolkien is. Like, I want to get a lot into the details of like the themes of Tolkien and why he wrote what he wrote and all of this stuff and all of the really interesting things there. But first, I just really want to set the tone. Tolkien is ridiculously influential in fantasy especially, but really like throughout a lot of other stuff as well. But when it comes to fantasy, I mean, the number of things that Tolkien may not have come up with, but did codify, make the way that we think about them is massive. I mean, hobbits are obviously a big one. I mean, find a fantasy world now that isn't like, oh yeah, we should have some kind of like small race that's basically human but a bit different. Like you absolutely can, obviously, because that's loads of fantasy. But it's like much more common. I mean, again, D&D like has halflings, and like again, that's something that Tolkien. There is, if I believe correctly, one source pre-Tolkien which mentions hobbits.
Yes.
But other than that, like again, Tolkien is massively again popularizing them as an idea and making them a thing, and now they exist in fantasy. And then other things like again the way he depicts elves and dwarves. Elves and dwarves existed before Tolkien, but never as such defined races. And certainly elves, especially. A lot of these ideas of like these tall, fair elves, and the idea of wood elves and high elves, and these different concepts about, again, how they worked. Again, that is massively influential, because, before that, elves and dwarves were both just sort of like mixed with the fantasy creatures of like fairies and things, where they weren't like really defined. They weren't really a people. They were just like things, again, if you read like old Norse stuff, dwarves and elves like appear, but they are very much just like plot point characters. They are not like this is a dwarf. Dwarves are like this, and elves are like there's not all that build up of the culture and all that stuff, which is very present in Tolkien and which carries on today. But then you get things like Ents, walking trees, super common again in fantasy now. You see them all of the time. Orcs, again, massively popularized. And my favorite version of this to show exactly how influential Tolkien was, Tolkien mixed up hobgoblins. He thought hobgoblins were larger goblins. Hobgoblins, pre-Tolkien, were smaller goblins. Hob meant smaller. And now hobgoblins are universally larger goblins. Because of Tolkien. Tolkien makes one mistake and it is now fantasy canon. It is now how that thing is. And, it's just incredibly influential. The way he depicts the dragon in The Hobbit as well is massively influential in how we imagine dragons. Yes, it draws upon other previous conceptions about dragons, of course, but a lot of the charismatic nature of dragons comes from Smaug, at least again in Western fantasy stuff. Obviously, again, there are plenty of charismatic dragons and other stuff, but again, the prevalence of them today in fantasy in the West is very much influenced by Tolkien. And dark lords and magic items of power that need to be destroyed in the place from whence they get, like magic glowing swords. I mean, I could go on and on about how ridiculously influential Tolkien is on the fantasy genre, but it's ridiculously.
Yeah. I love how you managed to go through this whole list of things that make Tolkien really influential, but you haven't mentioned the giant spiders.
Oh my god, of course. Giant spiders from that one spider that bit Tolkien one time.
Yes!
Like, spiders. They're crazy. And now, yes, again, giant spiders are just the thing. Like, you expect them in fantasy. You're like, oh yeah, giant spiders. Of course, that makes sense. Because of Tolkien. I mean, just everything. I mean, like, the conception of wizards as well as these, like, old men with staffs. Yes, that absolutely draws upon older things of Merlin and of Odin and of a whole bunch of different sort of magic users. But very specifically in Western canon, again, there is a lot of influence from Tolkien's conception of wizards, of these orders, this order of wizards, and, you know, wizards being wise, but, you know, sort of taking quite a backseat role to a lot of these things. And again, it's just like, there is so much going on with Tolkien.
Yes.
It's just amazing how much there is of Tolkien, and how much. I mean, Mithril. Mithril is, again, something you will find in fantasy time and time again, or things similar to Mithril, and again, Tolkien is there, like, yeah, I did this. I mean, even stuff like the grudge between dwarves and elves is something that, like, super, super common in fantasy these days. You have a dwarf and an elf, they probably won't get along. Every race as, like, a concept, like, obviously race as a concept existed before, but they are very prevalent in fantasy these days in a way that is kind of Tolkien. No, people would be like maybe like ghosts and stuff would be popular without Tolkien, but calling them wraiths and, like, again, like, nah, that's very Tolkien. And, you know, you see it time and time and time again. So many of these things come from Tolkien, and it's absolutely amazing. So that was the first thing I wanted to make very clear, was Tolkien super, 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 super influential.
Oh, of course.
And
but,
there
like,
is
I feel like a lot of the time, fantasy authors who kind of say, like, oh, I took my inspiration from Tolkien. You read it, and it's like, you just did not understand the themes of Tolkien's work at all.
I think, as we go in, because we're going to talk a lot about some of these themes, Nate, I think one of the big things that happens with Tolkien because of this massive influence is a lot of people get Tolkien wrong because they have read the bad imitators who did not fully get Tolkien's themes and have copied a lot of the artifacts, a lot of the surface level stuff without getting the rest of it. I mean, perfect example of this is dwarves having a grudge against elves. Yes, there absolutely is that historical grudge in Tolkien, but they are also very often allies. Like, they are so often allies against other evils. They have very little fighting amongst themselves. What fighting they do have is greatly seen as, you know, a real tragedy that these groups came into conflict. And there is also great friendship between groups of dwarves and elves, again, historically. Like, it very much depends who you're talking to about whether dwarves and elves, like, get along, because it depends on which dwarves and which elves.
Yeah.
Like, again, and that's another, oh god, such a big thing for Tolkien. Races are not homogenous. And again, that's something where it's like, oh, they're very homogenous in a lot of other things. But yes, I mean, I think that's a good space actually to move on then to an area which I think is so important to Tolkien, which is free will, and the way in which he thinks of characters. Because Tolkien, and this is partly influenced by his religion, which I'm sure I'll go into a bit more detail later, is a big believer in free will, in being able to make choices. And, you know, of pressures and things and lies and all this stuff and other people's wills, you know, all affecting that. But at the end of the day, you can choose. And choosing to do good, choosing to fight against evil, choosing to show mercy, choosing to be generous, choosing all of these things, that's an incredibly important thing to do. And there isn't this sort of inherent evil. From the very top, Morgoth, Melkor, and Sauron, obviously, in Lord of the Rings, to the very bottom, Ted Sandyman and Wormtongue and these, you know, very minor sort of servant type characters who are doing some mild evil, but still, you know, some evil. They are choosing to do these things. And yes, there are pressures and things and all that stuff, and that does amelioration of the evil. You know, Wormtongue, I think, in the narrative is seen as less evil than Saruman because he is much more pushed towards the things he's doing than Saruman is. But you still have that choice. You still absolutely have that choice of what you're doing. And very, very interesting in how it applies to the evil characters. You know, there's lots to be said about Sauron and Saruman being evil characters who have chosen evil and are given Sauron, not so much in the Lord of the Rings, for a variety of reasons, but Saruman is absolutely given chances to repent and stop being evil. He is consistently shown mercy by Gandalf and Frodo, and he persists in his evil actions, and in the end, his evil actions lead to his death because his cruelty towards Wormtongue leads to Wormtongue killing him. That's very important. But an area which I really love, and which we'll get into a bit about race in a minute, so many things I'm just going to hint at until we get to is how Tolkien always describes as making their choices, and how, again, Sauron and Saruman and stuff can influence them, absolutely, but they do still have that opportunity to make some choices. And this isn't always expanded upon within the books because it's not necessarily the place and space for it, but in other times he talks about, well, yeah, not all of the Easterlings and Haradrim to help Sauron. These choices that various evil characters make. Gollum is another great example, because Gollum, series of incredibly important choices that affect the fate of Middle Earth and what happens with the One Ring, and in the end dies making the choice to betray Frodo and try and take the ring. And very interesting, and it links to a theme of Tolkien's that, like, evil destroys itself, like evil weakens itself, evil hurts itself. It hurts other people as well, and that's bad, but it also makes itself worse. Sauron gives up power into the ring, and thus without it is weakened. And you get things from the Silmarillion of Sauron no longer being able to take a fair form after having been killed in the fall of Numenor, or loads and loads of different forms of evil coming back to hurt the evildoer. And again, I think that's a really important theme of the Lord of the Rings, is that good, but it can't help the evil. Even if the evil people win, they will undermine themselves. And that is, I think, a very good point to make. It's something I say a lot about in modern stuff about fascism, that fascism is a self-defeating ideology, that it always collapses because it's just a really bad ideology that cannot sustain itself. And, again, I'm not saying Tolkien's got any sort of allegories or stuff things, but I think, again, Tolkien has hit upon the very real fact that, yeah, being evil generally leads to bad stuff happening to everyone, including you.
Yeah.
It's not a winning strategy. It's not like people are going like, oh, well, I won't be evil because, that'd be good for the world. I mean, yes, there is an element of that, of I'm sacrificing things for other people. But there's also a big element of, this is just bad. Like, it will always turn bad for you. That's one of the big things about using the ring, is like, it will always end up turning bad for you. And I think that's a very important point, because evil is evil, and that's enough. But it's also stupid. Like, all these evils, racism, sexism, transphobia, pollution, all these things, they're evil, and that should be enough to stop them. But they're also just stupid. They're also just really stupid. And again, Tolkien's not necessarily talking about any of those things, but the general concept is very much there in his work, and I think carries on very well to this day. It reminds me of something that I believe C.S. Lewis said about evil and good, which is, good people know about both evil and good. Evil people know about neither. Which, again, seems like something that, again, I'm like, yeah, no, I feel like, I mean, they're friends, so probably Tolkien agreed with, because this idea of, like, evil is blind and foolish, as well as just being cruel and bad. Going to move on to another aspect of free will and how it interacts with something which is quite controversial within Tolkien fandoms and the sort of general things, which is race and racism in Tolkien. And I want to start off by saying, as people cannot see me, obviously, audio format, I am white, and so, I am aware that what I'm saying does come with that baggage, that viewpoint. But I do think, like, I have talked to other people who aren't white about this stuff, and it's not in a I've got black friends way, but in a, like, I do think this is reasonable to say in regards to sort of the general attitude of Tolkien towards race. a lot of the poor ways race is handled in Tolkien do seem very much to be cases of unfortunate implications and unintended consequences rather than racism, which, to be clear, is still bad and like is not okay to be doing, and people should like work to be better and all of this stuff, but is also very different. And I think that's one of the reasons why Tolkien still holds up fairly well, despite some of those, again, less than stellar ways of talking about some of this stuff, is because while, again, some of the terminology and some of the inferences about these things are bad, the overall messages, the overall themes, and so they can still hold up. It reminds me of that thing that I say again. You know, people who have the right attitude but the wrong terminology are way better than people who have the wrong attitude but the right terminology. You know?
Yes.
Like, and I feel like Tolkien very much falls into some of those things. You know, like obviously, you know, he's a product of his time and his nation and the imperialism and colonialism and racism that exists. But again, going back to this idea of free will and stuff, no, he's very clear. Basically, any time that men turn up, and by men I mean, you know, humans, that they have free will and are not really different from each other in any sort of real way. Like there are differences between them, you know, there are differences in their culture and their physiques and all these things, but they are all men. Going to the Silmarillion very briefly, they are children of Iluvatar. They have free will to decide their fate within the bounds of the earth and then move on. That is all equal. They are absolutely the same in that, which also ties into his religious views. You know, Catholicism, for all that it gets a lot of stick for how it behaves sometimes, has held for a long time that there is one human race, all part of God's creation. And yeah, Tolkien very much does have stuff that carries on with that. I mean, yes, it is true that his heroes do tend to be, that is certainly, but again, if you read the books, there are absolutely other things in for example, in the appendices, there is discussion of how the worried that marrying into the non-Numenorian races of men would affect their longevity and their power and you know how strong and noble they were. And it is explicitly called out that in fact the reverse happened. That when they started marrying into, say, the Rohirrim, it had no effect on their decline, and actually, if anything, slowed it. And again, I think that's a really important kind of point. And I think perhaps one of the most important things here for Tolkien and race that I think speaks both to the problems with Tolkien, but also the pros, is, as people have commented, you know, a lot of the ways he describes orcs especially are language that could also be used to describe there's lots of different things in terms of, you know, broad noses and eye shapes and skin color and stuff, which is very much related to racist language about people of color, even to this day. And I think it's very telling because Tolkien is actually, I spoke this at one point, and has a quote in which he's talking about the way that orcs look. And he's saying, I can't remember the exact quote, and I'm not going to use it because it does contain some racist language anyway, but he basically says, yes, orcs would look more like people from sort of Southeast Asia and thus less lovely, which I think again speaks very much to Tolkien's internal prejudice and things that like, oh, these are like uglier features and stuff, except that he follows that up with to Western eyes. And I think that's very important because it is an acknowledgement that that is not a universal, that is not an objective.
Yeah.
I was writing this book and I was thinking about what I and my readers would think was, you know, more monstrous, more off-putting. And yeah, I did that. And like, obviously, that still absolutely sucks for people who look like that. Of course it does. That's still like based in racism and all of this stuff. But it's very much more, again, as I said, the unfortunate implications and unintended consequences of these things rather than, oh yeah, orcs are like Southeast Asian people. And a lot of authors who copy Tolkien, who do way, way, way worse with this.
Oh,
Who,
of course.
again, I for making races homogenous, they do that as well with human cultures, where they're like, all of these people are this and all of these people are this. Absolutely not the case in Tolkien. There are Rohirrim and Numenorians who are absolutely terrible, and there are Easterners who are good. I mean, again, in the Silmarillion, there is a specific bit in which some Eastern men come over to the good side fighting against, at that point, Morgoth. And these are not the same Easterlings as are in The Lord of the Rings, but importantly, some of them do indeed betray the elves and the men of the West and turn against them. However, some of them absolutely stay loyal and indeed die fighting those men that betrayed them. And that's kind of exactly how it pretty much always is in Tolkien. Like, you do not get that homogeneity of all of these people are this way and none of them do good stuff. Like, absolutely rubbish. So rubbish. And that's really important. I think, again, going back to the free will, there's some incredibly important quotes that I want to bring up from Lord of the Rings, which I think are, because of how they impact the way in which we are made to think about these so-called, as it were, evil men. Now, the first of these is from the Two Towers, when they are waiting for dawn, and the orcs and Uruk-hai from Saruman are outside, but as are the wild men of the hills, the Dunlandings. And if you listen to this quote, I think, I'll talk about it more afterwards, but you can tell the men of Dunland are not depicted as just like wholly evil here, I think. So this is what they are saying. But these creatures of Isengard, these half-orcs and goblin men that the foul craft of Saruman has bred, they will not quail at the sun, said Gamling, and neither will the wild men of the hills. Do you not hear their voices? I hear them, said Eomer, but they are only the scream of birds and the bellowing of beasts to my ears. Yet there are many that cry in the Dunland tongue, said Gamling. I know that tongue. It is an ancient speech of men, and once was spoken in many western valleys of the Mark. Hark, they hate us, and they are glad, for our doom seems certain to them. The king, they cry. We will take their king. Death to the Forgoil, death to the Strawheads, death to the robbers of the north. Such names they have for us. Not in 500 years have they forgotten their grievance that the lords of Gondor gave the mark to Earl the Young and made alliance with him. That old hatred Saruman has inflamed. They are a fierce folk when roused. They will not give way now for dusk or dawn until Theoden is taken or they themselves are slain. And so that's the quote. And immediately, one thing I want to point out is, regardless of anything else that's being said about them, they are clearly brave. They are these fierce folk who will not give up until Theoden is taken or they themselves are slain. But also, and admittedly, this is somewhat subjective, to me, it sounds like they are given a very good reason to be angry at the Rohirrim, and while, there are certainly questions about, whose land it should be and all these things. Tolkien, doesn't necessarily get into too much detail about all this stuff. But those are very real grievances. Those are at the very least grievances. They're not doing this evil for evil's sake. They have grievances, and whether or not you agree with those grievances, that certainly puts a different perspective on what they are doing. And I also think that, again, when you're talking about something like Tolkien, this idea of like, oh, this is like an ancient thing is often used to show it as, important and worthy of respect. That happens a lot with oh, this is ancient Numenorian, this is ancient Elven, these things, these past things that we have now lost and we can't do now. And this Dunland tongue is an ancient speech of men. And again, I think that gives a certain amount of, not necessarily respect to the men of Dunland, but again, a different tone to their behavior and to how they are. And indeed later, when the Battle of Helm's Deep is over, while the men of Rohan are buried in a big burial mound, the men of Dunland are buried in their own burial mound further off. And again, that shows much more respect for them as people than you might expect from, again, a lot of the fantasy imitators who are like, no, these are the evil men. So, again, I think it is very telling of Tolkien's general attitudes towards people. And that in general, it's less that the people of Gondor or Rohan are inherently better. Being more powerful, they have a higher peak and a lower fall. When the Númenóreans, again from Silmarillion or indeed even in the Lord of the Rings with Denethor, when they fall, they do some really, really evil stuff. Again,
Yeah.
worth noting again, because this is the line that Aragorn comes from, and Faramir, and all of these characters who are seen as like great heroes and wonderful. The Númenóreans, when they go evil, they go super evil, committing mass executions and sacrifices and being absolute warmongers and slavers and pillaging all the lands and all of this stuff. They are so evil. And that's the descendants of the good guys in the Silmarillion and the ancestors of the good guys in the Lord of the Rings. And they do some terrible, terrible stuff, worse than anything that is described being done by the Dunlendings or the Easterlings or the Haradrim, because they have that choice. They can choose to do evil just as they can choose to do good.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go to the Return of the King, because there are two sections of quotes which I really want to find. Actually, technically three, but two of them are very close together, which are all super, I think, telling about the way in which these people are depicted by the narrative. These so-called evil men, and how they are, again, treated. And so Theoden and the Rohirrim, they are marching forward. They are riding forth against the foes outside of Gondor, and they are slaying many of them. And at this point, it mentions the Haradrim. It says, southward, beyond the road, lay the main force of the Haradrim, and there their horsemen were gathered about the standard of their chieftain. And he looked out, and in the growing light he saw the banner of the king, and that it was far ahead of the battle, with few men about it. Then he was filled with a red wrath, and shouted aloud, and displaying his standard, black serpent upon scarlet, he came against the white horse and the green, with a great press of men, and the drawing of the scimitars of the Southrons was like a glitter of stars. And reading that could easily have been said of the good people. In fact, right before, in Theoden's speech to the Rohirrim, inspiring them to it, he is yelling for fire and slaughter, a sword day, a red day. You can see a lot of the similarities between the ways, they're both like filled with like this fury and drive to fight. And equally, especially this last line, the drawing of the scimitars of the Southrons was like a glitter of stars. That is, I think, possibly exactly the way that Tolkien also describes elves drawing their weapons in parts of the Silmarillion. That is, again, not portraying them as necessarily good, of course, but certainly as something to respect. There's certainly something there that is more than just denigrating these people. They are brave and they go in to fight, and they look very noble doing so. And indeed, at the very end of the war, of this battle, after it's very clear that the men of the West, the good side, has won. There is this little bit about the end of the fighting. Hard fighting and long labour they had still, for the Southrons were bold men and grim, and fierce in despair, and the Easterlings were strong and war-hardened, and asked for no quarter. And so in this place and that, by burned homestead or barn, upon hillock or mound, under wall or on field, still they gathered and rallied and fought until the day wore away. That's, again, pretty powerful language to be speaking about these evil men. They are, bravely standing in fights which they, are not going to win, and asking no quarter. And again, that's not necessarily good. It's not showing them necessarily in a light of, generosity or mercy or any of these things, which Tolkien does value a fair bit. But it's certainly more complex than, again, you might expect if you've only been exposed to Tolkien imitators. And there is one last section, and this is perhaps my favourite section when it comes to showing the way in which men make their choices and very much not actually, they are servants, but they are not fully just doing whatever Sauron says, that they have their own will and their own power. There's a few, there is this moment here where it is, I think, very, very important, because it is just after the ring has been destroyed. And the men of the West, Aragorn and all his troops, are outside Black Gates, and they are ready. They have just drawn themselves up to fight a last desperate stand, just to distract Sauron long enough for the ring to be destroyed. But luckily for them, the ring indeed is destroyed, and this is the aftermath. The captains bowed their heads, and when they looked up again, behold, their enemies were flying, and the power of Mordor was scattering like dust in the wind. As when death smites the swollen, brooding thing that inhabits their crawling hill and holds them all in sway, ants will wander witless and purposeless, and then feebly die. So the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll or beast spell enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves, or cast themselves in pits, or fled wailing back to hide in holes and dark, lightless places far from hope. But the men of Ruin and of Harad, Easterling and Southron, saw the ruin of their war, and the great majesty and glory of the captains of the West, and those that were deepest and longest in evil servitude, hating the West, and yet were proud men and were men proud and bold, in their turn now gathered themselves for a last stand of desperate battle. Now, I think this is really, really powerful because, one, again, they are making their choice. Sauron is gone. They have and they are going to lose. And I especially like the phrasing, in their turn now gather themselves for a last stand of desperate battle, because that is explicitly drawing a parallel between what they are doing here and what the good forces were doing moments ago before the destruction of the ring. And I don't think you can draw those kind of parallels without suggesting a certain amount of, again, respect and again, choice, that power of choice, that power of free will behind men, that I think, again, is really important and is something that Tolkien really struggles with the orcs. He goes back and forth a lot about what the orcs are and how they are, because he, again, partly because he's Catholic, cannot really conceive of the idea of a being with free will being inherently, irredeemably evil. And what he eventually seems to settle on is the idea that orcs are pushed by Sauron's will to do evil, and the society they grow up in pushes them to be evil, and any that would resist that and would not fall into evil like this are killed. And so functionally, all of the orcs that you see are indeed evil, but that is as a product of multiple layers that push them to be evil. And again, hell of a lot more complicated than a lot of imitators would say, I think. And so, yeah, that's the element that I really wanted to get across about Tolkien and free will and how it interacts with all these racial good things, because he is really, really pushing, people make their choices, and those choices can be good or evil, but people make them. People have free will and can choose, and thus no one is inherently worse or better about it. No one is more inherently able to go, oh no, I will never do evil stuff. I'm only going to be good. That's not, again, the way that these things work. People are absolutely capable of, true for all of the, as I say, thinking races of Middle Earth, dwarves, elves, men, even the Valar and Maya, who are capable of doing evil and becoming evil. I mean, that's what Saruman does, that's what Sauron does, that's what, even before the creation of the universe, Morgoth did. And so, yeah, I do think there are absolutely problems with the way, people in Tolkien are written about in terms of race and all this stuff, but I don't think it's as bad as some people like to make out, because, again, I think it is much more complex a lot of the surface level imitators would have you believe about Tolkien. You know, one of his big things is, hey, anyone can do evil and anyone can do good. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about Tolkien and free will, because I think it's very important.
Yes.
And I think that also leads us into Tolkien and religion a little bit, because obviously a lot of Tolkien's stuff is heavily influenced by the fact that, and that has a lot of impacts on him. As I've said, one of the big ones is free will. He believes creatures have free will and can choose good, and that's really important. But there's other aspects to it as well, because there's things like the way in which there's always some hope of, you know, again, people consistently are given the chance to give up their evil ways. I mean, I didn't talk about it too much, but both the Dunlendings and the Haradrim, and in the end of both those battles that I was talking about, after they have been clearly defeated, many of them surrender and are treated reasonably well. Like, they are allowed to surrender, they are allowed to go home without their weapons and stuff. And again, that's really important. And again, the men of Dunling were buried properly. The orcs, by contrast, were burned in a heap. And again, like, I think it's very important is you know, they are being treated with, you know, to, you know, not have more bloodshed and violence. Saruman and Grimer and a whole bunch of other minor, like, evilly characters are not to do the evil that they're doing. That is, again, I think very important to Tolkien, is that, you know, you do not write people off about it. You know, you do not say this person cannot ever do good again. This is a very big thing with Gollum. With Gollum, it's a very big thing. This is such an awful creature. Bilbo should have killed him. And Gandalf is very clear. Well, maybe, but he may yet have a chance to do good, and do not be so quick to pass out death to people. Very important, and ends up being key to the destruction of the ring. Yeah, I think, you know, you can obviously see some of those religious aspects of Tolkien, but I don't think, you know, I know some people talk about it in sort of allegorical fashions and things like that, and Tolkien hates allegory, and it's more that his philosophy, which is obviously influenced by his religious views, comes through also in his works, you know?
Yeah.
And
because this is the thing that, like, he hated allegory, and he was so adamant that there was no allegory in any of his works. And then people go and read it, and they're like, "Well, this is an allegory," and it's like, no, it's not. Not everything is an allegory. Sometimes just the stuff that you think and the stuff that you've experienced influences your writing.
Exactly, and I'm going to go on to
okay.
World Wars as well. But one of the things I'm going to say is, it's like saying, oh, this food that he's describing, because he ate that food, like, it's like, you know, he describes a lot of food in Lord of the Rings, sounds delicious. And it's like, he probably ate food like that at some point, and that made it easier to describe it. And it's like saying, and therefore, Lord of the Rings is an allegory for lunch. like, no, obviously it's drawn from Tolkien's experiences of eating, but that doesn't make it an allegory about the eating that he's done. That's not the way it works. Inspiration and you know, experience and you know, drawing on these things, these themes and stuff that you yourself have belief in or feelings about and all this stuff, that does not make it an allegory. But yeah, no, so poor Tolkien. Where I'm going to go real deep, because this is what I really like, is Tolkien's experiences of war and how they come through in The Lord of the Rings. Because I think this is perhaps the very biggest one, which both the movies and a lot of the imitators screw up.
Yes. I wrote about this in my personal statement when I was applying for undergrad. So
You're amazing. I love that so much. A great personal statement as well. So, what about you? Well, you see, Tolkien, his experience of, like, are you in any way related to Tolkien? Nope, just like him. But no, so for people who are not aware of Tolkien's experience of war, Tolkien was in the trenches during World War One.
Yes, he was.
And indeed, there's a quote from him about this, which is, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something along the lines of, by 1945, all but one of my close friends were dead.
They made a whole movie about it.
Yeah, it's like, he is incredibly affected by the war. World War II, he is older, he's no longer on the front lines, although he does have some contributions in code breaking and things. But yes, his main interaction is with World War One. When people talked about World War II and World War One as allegories for Lord of the Rings, one of the things that Tolkien said, which I think makes very clear his opinions on the wars and how they went, was, no, if they had been allegories, the ring would definitely have been used against Sauron, and then Saruman would have developed his own ring, and there would have been great bloodshed and war between all of the peoples, and hobbits would have been made slaves by both sides, and it would have just been awful. Yeah, Tolkien is not a fan of war. Tolkien, again, from the reading books, believes that yes, sometimes you do have to fight against evil, and sometimes that does require violence and things. He does not like the actual war. He hates war so much, which is why a character like Frodo doesn't do much fighting. He is not a hero because he kills. Literally, I cannot think of a single person that Frodo actually kills in the story, and certainly none that are important. And in fact, what's super important is the fact that Frodo shows mercy. That is super important to the whole fact that Gollum is there, and that Gollum is then able, when Frodo does at the very end fail, is able to, unintentionally destroy the ring. That's really, really important. And later, when they go back and they find the Shire, Frodo is very keen on there being as little bloodshed as possible, and does not wield a sword against anyone during the fight to reclaim the Shire from Saruman and his. And again, that's really, really important.
It is.
And again, one of my favorite sections to show this is. There is one section in The Return of the King where Pippin and one of the young boys he is friends with from Gondor are watching all of the outlying lords and captains of the realm of Gondor come to Minas Tirith to help defend it. And it describes, in the way that Tolkien does in wonderful details, all of these people, their clothing and their types of weapons and stuff about them. And then a few chapters later, at the end of the Battle of Pelennor Fields outside Minas Tirith, it talks about how almost all of them died. Powerful, I think, to have that, to have these heroic figures, coming forth, and no, they all died. They like, and specifically, again, the way it's phrased as, they will never return home, and they died, and people mourned them, and it's terrible that they died. They die, in ways that aren't like, cowardly or anything. They die fighting and stuff, but they don't die doing any like great massive deed in the way of like slaying the Witch King or anything like that. They just die in the fighting, in very normal ways. And it even says, no few had fallen, hero or nameless, and no song has been written to tell of all of them, which again just gets the scope of the loss. And again, I think that's very much going to be informed by Tolkien's experiences in war, in that he knows so many people die. Good, bad, doesn't matter. So many people die, and there is so little you can do about it. And again, Tolkien hates war so much. There is a reason why one of the big differences, again, between the good guys and the bad guys is how much mercy the good guys show when they win wars. The bad guys brutalize and destroy and execute prisoners and mutilate people and all this stuff. And the good guys spare people and let them go home. And that is the major dividing line between them. And some of this might be because of the way in which orcs are kind of, again, within the books themselves, sort of presented as irredeemably evil. But some of it, I think, also might be Tolkien's own, again, experience of war. The heroes are kind of brutal and bloody in a lot of points. They are, especially against orcs, but against some of the men as well, they are quite bloodthirsty. You've got Gimli and Legolas's competition to see who can kill the most orcs at the Battle of Helm's Deep. And you've got, again, the way in which there is a lot of anger and wrath in a lot of the actions of Éomer or Theoden or various other figures, who are very much shown as being, filled with anger and rage against their enemies. And again, I think that's telling of Tolkien's experiences of war, because even good people in war are violent,
Yes.
and that has an effect on them. You cannot remain sort of fully impartial about the violence that you are doing, and you normalize it, and you make it a thing about anger and hate and all of these things. And again, I think very telling, Tolkien's comments on World War One, that we were all orcs during World War One. That there was not a good side that everyone was just brutal and terrible. And again, very telling of Tolkien's attitudes on war. Tolkien hates war so much, and I think possibly the very best thing that sums this up is Faramir talking about war and saying, I do not value the sword for its sharpness or the arrow for its swiftness. I only value that which they defend, which
Yes.
is core Tolkien. That yes,
that is like the quote of all time, isn't it? Like,
he's not a pacifist. He will fight. He does believe that there are things worth fighting for, but it's not about the fight. It's about the things you are protecting. It is about the good, and losing sight of that is bad. But also very easy to do during war. There are again lots of figures who are on very much the good side who do fall into that a little bit. They are like, yeah, we can kill all these orcs, hooray! And that is very much not a good thing. Like that is not something they should be praised and valorized for. But it just is a thing. It is how it is. That wrath. In fact, Tolkien a lot in when he's writing about violence and wrath, he talks again about that rage, about like a lot of the stuff in the Silmarillion, a lot of the stuff again in the Lord of the Rings, where there's battles, there is almost always rage and hatred and these big impulsive emotions, and those can lead you to be very successful. They can drive you on and have you fight the enemy and beat them and all of this stuff, and that can be important and it can be good that you have beaten that enemy. It's still again rage and hate and these negative emotions which can be quite destructive, and indeed a lot of the time people charge forward in rage and hate, they end up being overwhelmed and surrounded and killed. And again, I think that speaks very highly of if you do things for bad stuff, it will generally come back and hurt you as well.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that is really amazing. And I think, Tolkien, this is, I think, again, the big differences between the films and the books is the films are kind of actiony. And although they don't, fully portray war as like great and wonderful and stuff, they do sort of show it off a bit. It's flashy, it's cool. There's not as much focus on in general. There's focus on specific dead, this person died, and we're very sad about them dying. But there's not this sort of general grief that there has been so much loss, There is not that general, we are burying the Dunlendings as well because they also died, that you get from the actual books of Lord of the Rings, where it's terrible. It's really, really terrible. So that's Tolkien's attitudes on war and where he's coming from with war, and why I don't like, people saying any, oh, this is allegory for anything, but especially World War I or World War II, I get very annoyed at when people consider the books allegories about that, because no, not at all. Absolutely not.
It's especially frustrating sometimes because a lot of the time the same people who say, oh, this is allegory, are the people who say you should write what you know. And it's like, well, he did write what he knew. That doesn't make it an allegory.
Well, and I think another aspect of this is very important. Again, Tolkien treats war as very bad and difficult, and not as like this really glorious thing. And I think this is very notable in the aftermath of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, because the thing that marks Aragorn as a king after the battle is his healing powers, not his victory in the war.
Yes.
And equally, who have read the books may sometimes complain, like, oh, Éowyn does like one warrior thing and then stops and becomes a healer. And like, okay, I'm not going to say there aren't problems with the way women are depicted in Lord of the Rings. I think, again, it's one of those sort of unintended inference type things where there just aren't very sort of many places for them in the, fantasy medieval plot. I think a lot of the time when women are depicted, like, they are depicted autonomous people.
Yes, and this is what me and Piff Puff were talking about when she did an episode on strong female characters a few episodes back, and we were discussing whether Éowyn counts as a strong female character, and it's like, well, she made her own decision to take that path. She wasn't
exactly
like, it's not something that she was forced into.
Again, along with that,
she chose to fight, and then she chose to value healing and do that instead, and that's fine. People are allowed to do that.
Absolutely. And I think also it's very interesting because Éowyn does a really heroic action in defeating the Witch King, but she does also abandon her responsibilities at home. She is supposed to be looking after the people of Rohan while the other people are going to fight. Like, someone needs to remain to lead the people at home, and she abandons those responsibilities to go fight. She takes up the active sort of glory of war over taking care of the people. And, you know, there is very much this sense that, yeah, no, that's understandable, because she felt terribly unable to do anything, and that really wore on her and made her feel unsafe and helpless. And by being able to go and fight, she was able to feel better about that. But it's still not necessarily okay. Like no. That is still, you know, something she did that, you know, maybe she didn't done. But importantly, it's a choice. And as little as women are depicted in Lord of the Rings, it is true that I think pretty much universally they are shown as being able to make their own choices and having their own autonomy and being complete people.
Yes.
You know, the choices they make are so important. Arwen's choice to remain with Aragorn and become mortal. Éowyn's choice to go and fight. Galadriel's choice to refuse the ring and depart into the west. They are choices. They define the characters. It is so important, which is why, again, like, you know, obviously, like, there is some, like, sexism and stuff and stuff about, like, gender roles and all this stuff. It is still pretty important. Like, and that's why I think you can view a lot of these characters as strong female characters. And as I said, you know, Tolkien hates war, and Tolkien is very much of the opinion that if everyone was healers, the world would be a lot better place. So,
and like, he is right.
Exactly is. And it's not just, you know, oh, women shouldn't fight. It's that fighting in general is bad, and valuing healing and care and taking that as the choice that you make in order to feel more in control of your own destiny, a good choice.
Yes.
You know, don't go and fight about it. It reminds me very much of those posts you sometimes see on the internet of like, hey, don't post things to make TERFs or racists or any of these people mad. Post things that make people of color or trans people or you know, whoever feel safe. And again, I think it's that dichotomy. Yeah, it's cool and epic and even fun to go off to war and fight for the good thing. Healing, like caring for people, that's probably more important. That's probably actually a better thing to be doing. And that's not just for Éowyn, that is for everyone. Again, Aragorn's healing powers are what mark him as a king. So I think that's just like incredibly important. And it's interesting because I think there's one other really big thing about the way in which evil characters are evil and in which good characters fall in Lord of the Rings. And I think it's interesting because it ties into free will and it ties into making choices, as I said, which is possessiveness. A lot of the evil people in Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, and anything, are evil in a possessive way.
Yeah.
Morgoth wants to possess the world and possess the powers of creation. Sauron wants to possess power over others and dominion over the rings of power and over their wielders. Saruman wants to possess that power too and wants to have their own you know, realm under their control. Gollum even wants to possess the ring. Denethor is very jealous of his position as the ruler of Gondor and turns against Gandalf's advice and against Aragorn because he feels threatened by that, but is also very possessive over his sons. When, you know, when Boromir dies and then when Faramir dies, he is heavily affected by that, and part of that, you know, is just normal human grief, which again Tolkien would absolutely understand. But part of that, especially in the way his breakdown is shown after the death of Faramir, the loss of what it all means to him, and that's why sort of he, you know, that's part of why he sort of despairs and is like, I'm just going to burn us both and let the city fall, like it no longer matters. His sort of role within things, his position, his abilities are gone at that stage, and he feels hopeless. And hopelessness and despair is another big of Lord of the Rings. That's very much the powers of evil are to cause hopelessness and despair. But again, I think the way in which evil people often become evil in Lord of the Rings and Tolkien works in general is by being more possessive, you know, by wanting to possess things. Again, going to the Silmarillion, you've got Maeglin's desire to possess Idril, and you know, Fëanor's desire to possess his Silmarils and all of these things. So I do think there is a large amount of possessiveness in any of the evil in Tolkien. And I think, again, an element of being good is allowing things to be as they are to an extent. Like, not being passive about things, not fighting against evil and all these things, but, again, not attempting to force your will onto the world.
Yes.
That is wrong. And indeed is a flaw that good people are aware of. Gandalf and Galadriel both know that if they took the ring and used its power, they could absolutely defeat Sauron. And then they would set themselves up in a very similar way to Sauron, because they would think they know what is best for people. And even though it would start off good and people would be happy and everyone would love Galadriel or stuff, it would end up being bad, because you cannot force your will on people like that.
And it's that choices thing again, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It all interlinks. Everything in Tolkien interlinks so well, because again, he's got quite a solid philosophy about things. And again, I think that is very powerful. I think that's a very powerful philosophy to have. I think, in many ways I agree with it. I think, yeah, like, tell you what it reminds me of? It reminds me of a line from Discworld, which also has influences from Tolkien. Who knew? In which Granny Weatherwax is talking about what makes people evil, and she says it begins with treating people like things. That's where it begins.
Yeah.
That's where all evil, like that, that's the start of evil. It goes in lots of other places from there, but it begins with treating people like things. And I do think there's other stuff about evil and all this other stuff, but I do think, again, Tolkien and Pratchett have both said it very well there. Autonomy, it's super important.
It is indeed.
And yeah, I think it's very important. And actually, the mention of autonomy brings me back to another quote area that I wanted to talk about, which is also super important and which is also linked to race and religion and free will. There is this area where, so the men of Rohan are heading to Gondor, but they discover that there is a force of orcs ahead of them, and they would have to fight through, and they don't have time for that, and they might lose, and all of these issues. But luckily, the Druidan, the men of the forest, are able to help them, and they are able to sneak past. In talking to the Druidan, there are some really important points which I think are worth talking about. Because again, I think it speaks to Tolkien's attitudes on race and free will and some of these things. So Merry is hearing some drums, and he is told, "You hear the Woses, the wild men of the woods. Thus they talk together from afar. They still haunt Druidan Forest," it is said. "Remnants of an older time they be, living few and secretly, wild and wary as the beasts. They go not to war with Gondor or the Mark, but now they are troubled by the darkness and coming of the orcs. They fear lest the dark years be returning, as seems likely enough. Let us be thankful they are not hunting us, for they use poisoned arrows, it is said, and they are woodcrafty beyond compare." And then, as we move forward, they describe this man. On the ground sat a strange, squat shape of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass about his waist. His voice was deep and guttural, yet to Merry's surprise he spoke the common speech, though in a halting fashion, and uncouth words were mingled in it. And so already, I think you can tell from those descriptions, this is an, again, to Western eyes, unlovely-looking person, and seems maybe a little barbaric and stuff. But as you will find out, and as we go on, they are very much on the side of good.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk about some more, there may be a shade of the noble savage to what's to Tolkien's descriptions of this stuff, but even that I think is perhaps being a little bit unfair on Tolkien's descriptions. I don't think there's too much of that. And again, I think it's very telling of Tolkien's like, hey, not all people look good. Like just because someone's pretty doesn't mean they're good. Tolkien makes that point a lot, actually.
Yeah.
And again, this is a different people in a different culture, and interestingly, one who have been mistreated. Because as we go down here, if you are faithful, Gan Buri Gan, then we will give you rich reward, and you shall have the friendship of the Mark forever. Dead men are not friends to living men, and give them no gifts, said the wild man. But if you live after the darkness, then leave wild men alone in the woods and do not hunt them like beasts anymore. Which again suggests that the Rohirrim have been doing some bad stuff to these people historically. And unlike the Dunlandings, where there is again a somewhat question of like, well, they have these grievances, but are they justified and all this stuff? The Druidan, as is made clear in the books, are unquestionably on the good side and helping them, and did not deserve to be hunted like beasts. And it is that exactly incredibly important thing. And there is one other quite good quote that I think is good again from Ganbury Gan, in which he says, "Wild men are free, but not children. I am great headman, Ganbury Gan. I count many things: stars in sky, leaves on trees, men in dark." And again, like, that is a pushback against this, again, sort of infantilization of certain people, which again historically has been a big thing, and have evil and bad. And again, like, for a work written at this time period, at the height of the British Empire, I think that's pretty damn good.
It really is, to be honest. Like, I've read things written by the BBC within the past year about, like, the part of England that I'm from that is more weirdly racist than that is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, this is the thing. Like, I think there is a lot of very notable ways in which there is massive stuff that Lord of the Rings does that is better than a lot of stuff. And here's another one. When Aragorn is returning after the victories, and everything is good, and he passes by the Forest of Druidan, and he says, "Behold, the King Elisar is come. The Forest of Druidan he gives to Ganbury Gan and to his folk, to be their own forever, and hereafter let no man enter it without their leave."
Yeah.
Obviously, like, there's still some potentially questionable stuff about, like, giving it to them and stuff. But land return to indigenous people who have suffered under the actions of others.
We like land return. Land return is a good thing. That's what we're working for.
Like, I mean, like, here's the thing. Like land return is certainly a complicated issue and stuff, but it's certainly, again, like, and again, like, the way they're presenting it here is like, we're giving it to you as like a gift, which, like, did you have the right? Was it ever really yours to give? Is a question. But importantly, it's still way better than a lot of things you would see today, isn't it?
America, really take note.
the vibes of it are much better.
Yes. And
I also think it's really telling of that. Something that Frodo says to Aragorn, that, if you were a servant of the enemy, I think you would seem fairer and feel fouler. And yeah, that's another really big thing that Tolkien makes a point of lots of times, is that prettiness and beauty and all of this stuff is not indicative of goodness. And that these people who seem weird and strange and simple to you are actually not. They are full people living their own lives, doing their own things, and you should respect that and not hunt them like beasts.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's just this really, really impressive stuff to see from right at the time, because, like, yeah, obviously, again, like I've said before, there is bad stuff in Tolkien in the way that he talks about some of these things, absolutely. But the overall picture, the overall message that he gives is so good, even to this day. It holds up so much better than a lot of stuff. I mean, cough, cough, Harry Potter, but
yeah,
like, it genuinely is really good. And again, the more he expands on these things, the better it seems. If you read the Silmarillion, if you read the Unfinished Tales, if you read the Making of Lord of the Rings books, or if you read his letters and things, generally, the more he expands on it, the more clear it is that he's like, yeah, no, these people are our own people and they should be respected, and people aren't irredeemably evil, and even the orcs aren't irredeemably evil, and no, there were people in the East who were not on Sauron's side and all of this stuff, like other races. Yes, they value material things. But there is a brilliant quote from The Hobbit, which I am going to use here because it is just absolutely brilliant. It's Thorin talking about the life before Smaug came, and it says this: "Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvellous and magical toys, the like of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armour and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north." Now, obviously, there's material stuff going on there. But also, look at the way that they're talking about it, of the leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, the marvellous and magical toys.
Like they're talking about making things, like the toys especially, they're talking about making things better for like the children and making it so that everyone can live in like joy and happiness and pleasure rather than just existing.
Exactly, and the perfect counterpoint to this to show what actual, like, again, true greed is, as opposed to, dwarves, they're a bit too materialistic, to be sure. Like, that is commented on again in The Hobbit, where Thorin says to Bilbo, if more of us valued cheer and food above gold and jewels, the world would be a merrier place.
Yes.
There is an element of that. But what real greed is, it's here, is where they're talking about Smaug. Dragons steal gold and jewels, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever, unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armour. Now, that is very different to the way the dwarves were talking about their material possessions. That is not one recognizing what is like good, what is impressively built or things, only recognizing it for its material value, not enjoying any of it, not being able to do any of it yourself, and not giving any of it up. That's greed. Whereas again, the dwarves were talking, we had money to spend and to lend. We had time to spend in leisure building. Like, dwarves value craftsmanship and they value the material possessions, but a lot of what they value it for is for the craft that has been put into it. That is a lot of what it is about for them. They marvel at the fineness and the impressiveness of what has been done. And indeed, in Lord of the Rings, talking about these wonderful caverns within Helm's Deep, Gimli talks about these caverns being absolutely beautiful because of all the gems and things within them, and it's remarked that maybe they shouldn't mention this to dwarves because they will mine it all and it will be terrible, because it will be destroyed. And Gimli says, "No, you do not understand. No dwarf could be unmoved by such loveliness. None of Durin's race would mine those caves for stones or ore, not if diamonds and gold could be got there. Do you cut down groves of blossoming trees in the springtime for firewood? We would tend these glades of flowering stone, not quarry them, with cautious skill, tap by tap, a small chip of rock, no more, perhaps, in a whole anxious day. So we would work, and as the years went by, we should open up new ways, and display far chambers that are still dark, glimpsed only as voids beyond fissures in the rocks. And lights, Legolas, we should make lights, such lamps as once shone in Khazad-dûm. And when we wished, we would drive away the night that has lain there since the hills were made, and when we desired rest, we would let the night return." And again, something I really hate about dwarves, they are all like so gruff and taciturn in a lot of works. No, dwarves are incredibly well-spoken. Gimli is perhaps the most well-spoken member of the entire fellowship. And again, he is talking about the beauty and wonder of the natural world there, in stone and ores and things, and how they would craft it to show even more of its beauty. That, again, is not the sort of weird greediness of dwarves that is again shown in a lot of ways. And I also touch upon this because, people have said, Tolkien's dwarves are Jewish stereotypes. And Tolkien himself admitted, there is some ways in which dwarves and Jews, do have some similarities. Admittedly, a large part of what he was talking about was the fact that he based Dwarvish on Semitic languages such as Hebrew. But there are other things as well. But I think it's worth saying that being compared to any race is ever not a problem, because there's always problematic aspects of it. Of course there are. I don't think the dwarves in Tolkien portray particular negative Jewish stereotypes. And there's still problems, to be clear, with portraying any sort of stereotypes as, this group are like this. But I do think it would be unjust to call it anti-Semitic. Now, some of the other dwarves that, again, Tolkien imitators, and even in the movies, especially The Hobbit, they all have very big noses in The Hobbit, which is, again, not really a Tolkien thing. I'm like, yeah, no, that's definitely worse. But I think, again, if you look at the way in which dwarves actually behave in Lord of the Rings and how they are, I think it is quite a stretch to view them as a negative portrayal of Jews, if at all they are a portrayal of Jews, which again I think is also something of a stretch as well.
Yeah, I mean, I read an article a while ago, so I can't remember the exact details of it, but it was written by a Jewish person, scholar, I guess, who was a fan of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, and they'd basically said that their interpretation of The Hobbit was that it was not just the dwarves as a race, but the plot as a whole was an inherently Jewish story because of the way it was structured, and the idea of them being basically in diaspora from their homeland and trying to come back to it and find it in different places. And yeah, I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but they were sort of saying that even if they are a Jewish stereotype, the story is Jewish enough that it doesn't matter to them that much. Exactly. But that's also obviously only one person's interpretation of it. So
no, absolutely. And again, as I say, I will also say, as I said before, I'm white. I'm also goy. I cannot comment too much about these things. But again, taking a broad view, in comparison to other things and these stuff, again, I think it holds up fairly well. And again, having talked to Jewish people about it, the general consensus is, yeah, it's not a particular problem. Yeah, maybe sometimes there's some stuff that would be, would prefer a little bit different. But yeah, in terms of things Jewish people are concerned with, the representation of dwarves in the Lord of the Rings itself, as opposed to, a lot of its imitators and stuff, tends not to come up very much.
Yeah.
And the other side of this that I wanted to mention is, of course, Tolkien wonderfully responds to a message from
oh yes.
Now he gives 2 letters to his editor, and the editor doesn't send this one, which is an absolute shame. But the letter that he sends to his editor, which he doesn't send, which is luckily preserved, about oh, do you have any Semitic heritage? One is what on earth is no, it's actually about Aryan heritage, I think. It's
yes, it was the German editors.
do you mean the people around Iran? Because that's the area of Aryan peoples. And no, I don't. But also, if you're asking me about Jewish heritage, I have to say, no, sadly, I don't have any of that wonderful people. And again, Tolkien hated the Nazis so much.
I know.
And again, yes, I absolutely think there's problems with Tolkien, and if he was alive today, I have no idea what he'd think about a whole bunch of things like homophobia and transphobia and all these stuff. But I will say, as someone that is queer and trans about things, I do get the vibe that Tolkien, again, might not have been on my side about a lot of these things, but probably would have defended me against a lot of the virulent stuff.
Yeah.
I get a vibe very much that I get from Pope Francis, for example, who's like, hey, look, they shouldn't be doing this, but don't hurt them about it. That won't be good. And, maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's ridiculous. We'll never know. Tolkien died a while back.
Yeah.
But I think the very fact that it gives off so much of that vibe speaks very well of the story and of Tolkien's attitude, I think that is very important. And I think also the the other side of this that I think is really interesting is, as I was talking about with the dwarves, as well as being, not necessarily greedy, valuing material things, but not so greedy, there's loads of other things about them that, again, just come up. Their love of music. There's an entire song in The Lord of the Rings about back in the time of Durin, when Khazad-dûm, when Moria was still going, and they would celebrate and play pipes and drums, and part of the sadness of the end of the thing is those are silent now. And again, that's not something. Love of music is not something you usually get from dwarves in fantasy. And also, again, a really powerful thing. There is the Mirrormere, which is a beautiful still lake in which the stars are reflected like jewels. And this is incredibly important to the dwarves, to the extent that after getting through Moria and the death of Gandalf and being absolutely shattered and tired and exhausted, Gimli still wants to go and see it, and does with Frodo, and admires the beauty of this lake with the stars reflected in it. And again, that is not an attitude of the dwarves in a lot of fantasy, to look at a lake in which the stars are reflected and to decide that this is one of the most beautiful things. Dwarves love the natural world, and although they don't necessarily have the greatest appreciation for all aspects of it, and not necessarily the same relationship with trees and stuff that Legolas's people do and all this stuff, no, they absolutely value it. And they are not just weird, greedy, materialistic stereotypes or anything like that. No, they are complicated people capable of good and evil, but certainly not inherently evil in any way. And in fact, one thing I quite like about dwarves is they are very indomitable. And in fact, it's mentioned that when the rings are given out to the various peoples of the world that Sauron then uses to try and control them, the mortal men, they absolutely become controlled and become the ring race. The elves hide their rings so they don't get affected by it, and don't use them until Sauron is defeated. And then when the ring is destroyed, their powers go as well and they leave. The dwarves do use them, and it does have bad effects on them, but those effects are pretty much just magnifying their own greed. They do not, in the way that the ring race did, become subservient to Sauron. They are their own people still, even as they fall into evil.
Yes.
That's very interesting and complex. And I really, really love it. I really love how complex every group in the Lord of the Rings gets more and more attention. The more attention you give it, the more deep and complex and clear it is that Tolkien has thought a lot about these things. And again, I think it's that thing of a lot of the imitators make it very Planet of the Hats, where, again, if you've seen the overly sarcastic production episode of Planet of the Hats, we talk about a lot of things do that with elves and dwarves and all of these things, and it's done very badly. Whereas, again, in the books, everyone has so many different things, even amongst the hobbits. Yes, there's the very sort of respectable, plain, unassuming hobbit of the Bagginses and stuff, but there's also the crazy adventurous Tooks and the wild Brandybucks, and there is big differences between them in that, the Brandybucks like swimming and they like going on boats in a way that other hobbits find weird because they don't like water and they avoid that kind of thing. And there's also things like the way elves, they're displayed as they're such nature people, so connected to nature, and a lot of elves are, but the Noldor, who have some of the most important elves in the history of Middle Earth are not. They are miners and forgers like the dwarves. And in fact, in Lord of the Rings, there is Legolas talks, these were strange elves that lived here. The trees do not remember them, but the rocks do. And again, that is a difference that you would not get in a lot of works about elves, but Tolkien absolutely does it. Tolkien absolutely has these proper differences, and again, they are full and complete things, because even within that, there are differences between all of the people. It's not like all of these elves are Smith. It is that is an area which they tend towards, which they, have more skills in which they have tended to focus on. But there are absolutely variations within that. There are ones who are not. There are ones who are more warriors. There are ones who are more hunters. There are ones who do other things. It's all very much a mix. And again, I love that. Again, every time you dive deeper into an area of Tolkien, you find more stuff. And I think that is super important. And like I think it's really, really impressive that, again, Tolkien has really thought about all of these things. He has put so much effort. I mean, partly just because he really wants to play around with languages, which is we'll get to languages in a bit, because I don't have too much to say about them, just because it's amazing, but it's not like too complicated. But like, yeah, it's great. And yeah, the other side of things I'm going to talk about with these things is, I think it's very interesting. I actually read an article about Tolkien and race previously, and although it had some good points and made some good things, I knew that I wouldn't agree with it fully, because it began by saying, in Tolkien's world, elves are the best thing you can be. And as soon as I read that, I knew it was someone who didn't really get Tolkien. Because, no, indeed, if anything is the best thing to be, it's probably hobbits, but even hobbits, it's definitely not elves, because it makes very clear, again, more in the Silmarillion than Lord of the Rings, that elves have a very difficult time because they are bound to the circles of the earth, which means even when they die, they're not gone. They don't move on. They go to another part of the world. They go to the halls of Mandos and can, in fact, come back from there and be reincarnated. And it's explicitly said in the Silmarillion that will wear on them, and they will just become so tired of everything. And that even the great powers, the Valar and the Maya, who are also bound to the circles of the world, will also feel that. But men pass on, and where they go, no one save Iluvatar knows. And it has been promised that they will indeed, they don't just go to nothing, that they will be part of the second song with Iluvatar, which is at the end of the world, and sort of remakes it to be better. But no one knows. No one knows for sure. And with that comes a lot of fear of death, which is, leads to a lot of bad things that men do and stuff that happens. But also, it is explicitly said that this gift to pass on and not stay within the bounds of the earth forever, is something that even the great powers of the Valar and Maya will envy. And yeah, again, I think that's very important. I think it's the thing in which, again, imitators often make elves just like better than men. And like in Tolkien, elves are more resistant to diseases. They are more able to heal from grievous wounds and go on without sleep and things. They are hardier. They are better at a whole bunch of things. But they're not better than men. They're not like inherently better. Whatever some elves may think. That's not the way it works. And some of the greatest heroes of all of the history of Middle-earth are men. Because of some of, again, the unique qualities of men and their abilities, and especially the other gift of Iluvatar, the other side of things, which is that, for those of you who haven't read the Silmarillion and don't know these things, at the very beginning of the world, Iluvatar, who is basically God, and the Valar and Maya, who are basically angels, sing a song, and this creates the world. Again, Tolkien loves music.
Yes.
But there's an important aspect of this, in that everything that happens in the world is ultimately part of this song. And the Valar and Maya know some of it because of their part in being part of the song, although they don't know all of it because they weren't singing all of it. They only know the parts they were singing and maybe some of the parts that they paid attention to as well. Iluvatar specifically is the only one who did the sounds for elves and men, which means that they are uniquely his, and the Valar and Maya have very little knowledge of them, sort of philosophically speaking. They learn about men and elves and stuff, and they learn what they're like and all this stuff, but they don't have sort of foreknowledge about them. Much. They might have a little bit. But very importantly, all of these things are bound to what was in the song to a certain extent. Again, there's free will and stuff. But, there is a certain amount to which there is fate and destiny as well. Men, however, are specifically given the ability to, within the destiny of the world, to shape their own fate. Again, in a way which not even the Valar have. Men are, like, free will is a big thing for all of Tolkien's stuff and all of that, but men are like even more radically free than the usual.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that to the kind of person that Tolkien was is very important. I have on that point, one other thing, again, I'll talk about this more perhaps another time when I'm talking specifically about the Silmarillion, but on the dwarves, I absolutely love the fact that the dwarves are not created by Iluvatar, but are adopted by him and given free will by him, and that affects some of their relationships with other people as well. It's a really interesting concept, and again, not one that comes across in a lot of stuff, but they are still seen as, again, like equal to men and elves and not like some lesser group. It's great. It's amazing. But the other thing I was going to say about Tolkien, and this is actually, this is one of those things where I'm like, oh man, this is tough. As I was saying, because elves and men, elves sort of stay within the realms of Arda, within, Earth in some form, and men don't, they pass on. This is really big for things like Arwen's decision to become mortal and stay with Aragorn, because that is not just not being with her father during her lifetime. That is being sundered from him in the afterlife as well until the end of the world. And for someone that's going to live for the entirety of the world until that, yeah, you can get why Elrond is so upset by the concept and why he makes it so difficult for Aragorn.
Yeah.
That is big. And also, again, like, there's an influence here because Tolkien was Catholic and his wife converted to marry him. And less Aragorn and Arwen, more Beren and Luthien, who are in the Silmarillion. We'll talk about them another time. But again, there's a slight element of, wow, Tolkien, like, that's really sweet that you love your wife this much.
Yeah.
It's also like kind of like philosophically terrifying that you're like, yeah, she's sundered forever from her family to marry me. That's like really sad. I'm gonna write a whole book. And like, yeah, it's just absolutely amazing. And I also think I'm going to talk about this very interesting difference between the books and the films, actually, because I mentioned it before about the scouring of the Shire. And if you've only seen the films, what this is when they return to the Shire, they find that Saruman has been there before them and has essentially caused a lot of devastation in terms of sort of setting up like basic industry stuff that is kind of pointless because it's not doing anything. They've set up a bigger mill, for example, but they don't have any more grain to grind with it, so it's useless. But in doing so, they've destroyed like lots of the environment, and there are men and indeed some hobbits who are helping Saruman and basically enforcing his rule on behalf of Otho's, or it might be Lotho actually, but one of the Saxville Bagginses, who's one of Frodo's relatives. And one, this is a great sign that even hobbits can do evil. That's important.
Yeah.
Two, I think it's very interesting that this is what happens because there's an element of, you can't go home again because of your stuff changing you. Frodo doesn't end up staying because he's been too affected by his stuff. But in the films, there is no change in the Shire. The Shire is the same, and it's just that Frodo and his experiences made it difficult. But in the books, Frodo still had those experiences and it's still too difficult, but the Shire has also changed.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I couldn't say sure, but I would imagine, again, talking about inspirations, coming back from the trenches, people who didn't go to the trenches cannot understand what you went through. And that's going to have an effect on you, obviously.
Yeah.
But again, for World War I and World War II, the home front was also a thing. Like, things massively changed at home as well. They also they were different, but they were also there. Whereas these days, I wonder if there's a bit more reflection of the fact that in the West, at least again, we might send soldiers to war and they might come back and not understand how to relate to society. But the society doesn't change from the war. Sure, there's some side effects, but the amount that the Iraq War impacted people within Britain is tiny.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's part of why you get that slight difference. Again, couldn't possibly, actually say because it's, I don't know the mind of Peter Jackson. It may have just been time constraints and things. But I am just a little bit curious about that, of whether it's like, yeah, people come back from the war and they don't understand the home because the home hasn't changed. Whereas again, for Tolkien and Frodo, they came back from war heavily changed and unable to fit society. But also society had also changed because of the stuff as well. Home was not safe.
Yeah. I mean, technically it does show up in the film, but only for like 2 seconds as a very brief clip of a possible future when
Yeah,
Frodo looks in
very mirror
Galadriel's
Galadriel,
thing.
but
But I don't think that really counts.
no, I also don't think that really counts, especially because it very much doesn't seem to have happened in the actual work. Like, that doesn't seem to be the thing that did
No.
happen. And there's a deleted scene of how Saruman dies, which is very different and everything. So seems very unlikely. But yeah, like I think all of this stuff is really interesting. And I think, again, talking now a little bit about the way despair and hopelessness is handled, I think that is a big way in which the powers of evil work. Denethor, for example, is unable to be dominated by Sauron, even in the depths of his grief. He refuses to serve Sauron. He is stronger than that, which I think is also another thing about free will and the powers of men, because Saruman, who is, metaphysically way more powerful than Denethor, is suborned by Sauron. And while he's always, plotting to try and, betray Sauron and get his own power over it, he is way more controlled by Sauron than Denethor is.
Yeah.
But what Sauron can do to Denethor is make him despair, make him feel that the fight is hopeless and that he might as well give up. And that happens a lot. That is very much a tool of evil that is used again and again. People despair and it makes them unable to carry on, and evil is able to defeat them. Happens a lot more in the Silmarillion, to be fair, but it does also happen in Lord of the Rings. And it's very important because, again, that is something that absolutely is probably informed by some of Tolkien's personal experiences, but also he really values hope. Hope is an incredibly important thing, along with love and compassion and mercy, and to a certain extent faith. But it must be said that of as much as I say, Tolkien's very religious and his religion impacts what he writes, faith is very minor in The Lord of the Rings. People do not pray very much. There are like very minor references to imploring the Valar for help in one battle when someone's running away from a Mumakil. Mumakil is the plural. Tolkien nerd. And that is, I think, again, notable that even though he does, again, have this very religious idea about how things are, he's a devout Catholic and stuff, despite this, he is not making anything really religious a pillar of what he's writing about. No, he's making more universal concepts of hope, mercy, forgiveness, and of overlooked people being able to still contribute important, in fact, absolutely vital acts. And it is not the great and the glorious who win. It is the humble and the ordinary. Frodo, who is very under noticed by a lot of people throughout the books. That is part of the whole plan, is that Sauron won't think about him.
Yep.
And even readers today often sometimes be like, oh, Frodo doesn't really do much. Like, he's not much of a hero, but that's kind of the point, is that he's not doing anything flashy, but he is just enduring and doing his best, and that is still heroic. But also, of course, Sam, an incredibly ordinary person. Amongst all of these people, just hang on, I will give you a very brief rundown of the 9 members of the Fellowship, and then tell you about Sam is the most important one, because you have Aragorn, descendant of the Númenóreans, rightful king of Gondor and Arnor. Boromir, also descendant of the Númenóreans, son of the steward of Gondor. Legolas, son of the king of Mirkwood. Gimli, descendant of the Durin's line, the most important royal family of dwarves. Gandalf, a literal angel in human-ish form. Pippin, Merry, and Frodo, members of the 3 probably most important families of hobbits.
They are landed gentry.
They are landed gentry, and they are young, especially Pippin, and they are impulsive, and well, especially Merry and Pippin, less so Frodo.
Yeah.
But within Hobbit society, they are elevated. They are, as much as hobbits are, of noble blood. So again, this is the lineages of all of these people. And for people that talk a bit about how like Tolkien focuses too much on like blood stuff and lineages and all this like weird stuff that they find off-putting, a little bit understandable. But the counterpoint, the amazing counterpoint, is Sam, who is a gardener and descended from Gaff. Like, he's descended from his gaffer, and he is absolutely no one important at all. Even in Hobbit society, he is not important at all.
And yet.
He is possibly the most important figure in the entirety of Lord of the Rings. His compassion towards Frodo, his determination to help, and his ability to resist the ring because it offers to him the power to make the entire world his garden. And he's like, well, I couldn't garden that much. And he's like, oh no, other people would do it for you. And he's like, but I want to do the gardening. It's, he is still, to be clear, the ring still does have some power over him. It's not that he's entirely immune to it. But again, that very simple good sense and that very simple valuation of what is good. Again, Sam gets a lot of crap by a lot of people sometimes, especially, for some of the more like stuff in the films that's kind of like comedy based. But Sam is absolutely amazing and so good. And
I love him.
Again, this is perhaps Tolkien's biggest sign of, hey, ordinary people, like the most ordinary, like literally so ordinary, can be so important. Aragorn, Gandalf, Gimli, Legolas, Boromir, all of these massively important figures, Galadriel and Elrond and Glorfindel and everyone else, Eowyn and Eomer and Sauron and Saruman, massively powerful figures of epic lineage and sometimes vast power. And Sam does more than any of them. Sam is more important than any of them, and that is so damn good. And yeah, I just think it's absolutely incredible. And I think there is so much to be said for Sam. And I think in many ways it is the sort of best counter argument to people saying, oh, like Tolkien's like weird about like lineages and stuff and has this weird thing about like who you're descended from and stuff. And I made a counterpoint to that sometimes with the way in which, as I said before, the kings of Gondor worried about marrying into Rohirrim because it might affect their ability, and they found actually had no effect. If anything, it helped them. But the best counterpoint is the fact that Sam is the plainest of the plain and is so important and is so hailed by the narrative. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just absolutely amazing.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. Sam is just like, God, I don't actually know what to say because I love him so much.
and that's so fair. And again, I think Tolkien so clearly shows the value of the little things, the joy that can be found in everything. In the Hobbits walking, when they have their walking songs. In baths, which again they have a song about. In meals, which they value. In good company, in cheer. Again, if you value food and merriment, the world would be a merrier place. And there can be valuation and appreciation of beautiful arts and crafts and even valor in war, but more than any of that is the simple everyday stuff, the joy of life.
Yes,
I think Tolkien is really big on. Tolkien is really big on the fact that, look, the darkness can never be fully defeated. There will always be evil, and it will always need to be fought. Good has to triumph time after time after time. But even then, even with all of that, there can be such beauty and joy and love within the world. And that is just absolutely amazing.
Yes, it is.
And again, it's coming from someone who went through one of the worst experiences that humanity has ever been through, World War One and the trench warfare within it. And to be able to come back the other side and write such a beautiful, powerful work that describes in detail all of these beautiful natural wonders and other wonderful things like the good meals and the songs and the friendships. That's really, really impressive, because 1,000 authors can take the horrors of war and write about them, and it will be powerful and moving. But to write a book that does still include those absolute horrors and does still include incredibly grey moral areas and characters who fail and losses that you can't recover from and being unable to go home again. To be able to write a book that has all of that, but is not crushing, is not about how terrible it all is and how there's nothing you can do, is not hopeless or despair, is not a book of grief. It is a book of joy and celebration of good over evil and of the wonder and the really beautiful things that can exist within the world if people work to protect things, if people work to create things, if people work to heal things. That's incredible. And I think is no greater sign than of what Lord of the Rings is trying to say than the fact that from someone coming back from World War One and having experienced all that, you can still write a book that is so filled with wonder and joy for the world as a whole and hope for humanity and the peoples as a whole. Nothing is a greater sign that the message of Lord of the Rings, that yes, there can still be good even amongst all the terror and evil and horror of war. There can still be good things and people can still do good and there can still be love and happiness. Nothing is a better sign of that than the fact that he wrote the damn book.
Yeah. I do wonder if maybe like one of the reasons why it's such a prominent like theme within the books is that he appreciates it more because he's come back from such an awful experience of war and death and destruction and everything.
Yeah, I think it's good. And you know, just to touch a little bit on Tolkien the man, like, you know, with this incredibly serious Oxford Press and things, and people, you know, probably think of him as like, you know, this very old sort of serious man, you know, writing his books and things. He seems so fun-loving because there's just a few stories I know about him. Of one, him and C.S. Lewis turning up to
the costume party.
Well, no.
It was a non-costume party.
A normal party, but dressed as penguins.
Yes.
Which, okay, that's amazing. And then my other favorite one of these is a invitation from to celebrate their son Christopher Tolkien coming of age. 6:30 p.m. onwards. RSVP if not coming. Carriages at midnight. Ambulances at 2 a.m. Wheelbarrows at 5 p.m. At 5 a.m. Buses at daybreak.
I love it so much.
Which again, like, Tolkien is filled with happiness and joy so much of the time.
Yes. I do think it's quite funny that Diana Wynne-Jones, who, for people who have never read any of her books, A, what are you doing with your life? And B, she was an author, very, very prominent for like children's fantasy literature. She was in Tolkien's like class at Oxford. Like, as in, he was her teacher. Lord of the Rings, I guess, at the time, or maybe the Silmarillion, one or the other. And he deliberately made the class really hard to try and get people to go away so he could write. And she just kept showing up every week so that he would have to teach. They had this very sort of friendly but antagonistic relationship wherein he desperately wanted her to go away so he could write, and she just desperately wanted to just keep showing up. just so that he couldn't, which I think is very funny.
And that is also classic Tolkien, and it reminds me very much again of the thing of his friendship with C.S. Lewis, which is a beautiful little friendship.
Oh, yes.
They nearly stopped being friends because Tolkien didn't like the fact that he was including Father Christmas in the Chronicles of Narnia. He was like,
Yes.
"What is Father Christmas doing in Narnia? It makes no sense. You're crazy." He's like, "No, it's fine. It's good." But yeah, my other favorite thing about Tolkien is the Ents coming in Helm's Deep in Isengard is partly based on his frustration that in Macbeth, Birnam Wood coming to Dunsinane is just people taking branches of trees to use as camouflage. He's like, that's crappy. I'm going to write a story where trees actually do come and destroy things.
And he is correct.
Great. And like, yeah, I love so many different aspects of Tolkien, the hope, the joy, the renewal. And yeah, like stuff is lost and that is terrible and it can never be regained. That doesn't mean it's all bad. And I think that's again really, really powerful. And I also think that with his overall message and his general war and peace and love, mercy, material stuff, all of this stuff, I think it all holds up so well, and I think it remains relevant to this day as well. Like, I don't think that philosophy has stopped being important. And I think you've got things like that brilliant quote of, "I wish I did not live to see such times." And Gandalf saying, "So do all who live in such times. All we can do is choose what to do with the time that is given to us." And again, I think, the modern age, it can seem very overwhelming. There are so many problems that we face, and it can seem scary and impossible. And you can be very jealous of people who didn't have to deal with this. I'm relatively young. My parents' generation, they got to live through a time of massive changes that made their lives easier. Massive increase in vaccinations, massive increase in technology, increases in education and welfare and all of this stuff. While they, may well see things go worse now, they are unlikely to see, a lot of the stuff become really severe in terms of stuff like the climate crisis. They don't have to worry so much about the housing situation or a whole bunch of other issues. And again, that can feel very frustrating sometimes. Seeing, again, what goes on in the Lord of the Rings and seeing the difficulty and the, in many ways, reluctance to deal with it, but still going on to deal with it, still fighting because there is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for.
Yes.
It's very powerful and very moving to me to this day. And Lord of the Rings is one of the things which is capable of making me cry, which most things are not capable of doing. I cry very, very little, but Lord of the Rings, some of those scenes, again, those scenes where everyone is recorded as dying, or some of the more powerful songs in it, or just a whole bunch of different things. Oh, they are so powerful and so strong. And I just think, again, there are just so many moments of mourning, of appropriate mourning for people. And they are usually done by song, but they are so good. After Boromir dies, for example, and is buried, Aragorn and Legolas sing a song about the people of Gondor waiting for Boromir to return and their grief when they hear he is dead. And Gimli remarks that he is too grief-stricken to sing. And again, very powerful, very powerful. Or again, just seeing so many important moments in the books revolving around people having to choose what to do and choosing, a lot of times to do the hard but good choice. Faramir choosing at the cost of, his potential relationship with his father, is already not good, but risking, that his father will certainly be angry at him for not taking the ring back to him, choosing to let Frodo and Sam go on their journey. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli choosing to go after Merry and Pippin and try and rescue them, even though it means that Frodo and Sam, they have no idea where they've gone and they won't be able to catch up to them because they just refuse to give up on their friends like that, and because Frodo has made it clear that he does not want that company at this stage and that he needs to go alone. Boromir choosing, having been tempted by the ring and having made a terrible mistake, choosing to try and save the hobbits and failing, but importantly, being valued so much for having made that choice all the same, for having tried, even if eventually it was futile, for still having tried to do that good. Again, I think so many moments in The Lord of the Rings are powerful because of that choice, because you had the option to do something else. You had the option to hide or give in or give up, but they don't. Except sometimes they do. Sometimes they fail. Frodo, at the end, fails, but they are still considered heroic because they tried so hard and they reached their breaking point, and it is understood that everyone has that breaking point where they will break. And that while that is terribly sad, and while it would have been better if they hadn't broken, there should be compassion for them for having gone so far and suffered so much. And again, that is something that you don't even see in a lot of media today about war and good and evil and all this stuff, where it's like, oh, they failed, they're bad now. Like, no, Tolkien is like, no. It is, again, just so powerful, so hopeful. And again, I think that theme of forgiveness is also, again, another really important aspect of Tolkien's works in Lord of the Rings, and indeed in his works in general. And yeah, I really, really love it. I think it's really, really good. I think also there is this element to all of his works of, things potentially, yes, getting worse. That there are these almost cataclysmic events which cause massive problems and stuff is lost forever. That is present in Silmarillion especially, but it's also present in the Lord of the Rings. There are things like Lothlorien and Rivendell which become lesser at the end of Lord of the Rings, and stuff like Frodo needing to leave because he can no longer bear to be in Middle Earth, and all kinds of stuff like that, where there is absolutely loss that will not be recovered from. And that is really, really tough. It's a good ending. It's the good ending. The good guys won, but stuff is still lost. And I think that's also really important.
Yeah.
I think it's really important again, for people who view it as like this simplistic good and evil story, especially because of the imitators, you would not get how complicated, again, these things are, where it's like, we won, and there is still bad stuff, and it is still really difficult. And I think the perfect example of this, again, is in the Scouring of Shire. Saruman is so pleased because they cannot return the Shire to the way it was. And thanks partly to some soil that Galadriel gave Sam, they are able to restore the trees and plants and stuff faster than they would have been able to otherwise, in years rather than generations. But it's still not the same. Like, stuff was still destroyed. People lost their housing. Trees that were there and were old are dead and gone, and new trees will grow to replace them, but it won't be the same. But again, it's that thing of, yes, we lost things and they will never come back, but new things can come. We can build and it won't be the same, and that loss is still painful and difficult, but it is not the end. And I think that is the maxim against despair. Yes, things can be terrible, and you can lose things that you can never get back, but it is not the end. Do not despair. Rebuild, remake, do something new. And again, I think that is very, very important to Tolkien's general things. And again, I imagine probably his experience in World War I and general life experiences as well would have had a big impact on that. And I think Tolkien is, again, I think that thing C.S. Lewis said, good people understand both good and evil. I think Tolkien is very understanding of why people fall, of why people fail. And I think the perfect example of this is in the appendices, actually, when Arwen is talking to Aragorn as he is dying. And she is absolutely grief-stricken. And she says, I now understand why your ancestors, the Númenóreans, became so obsessed with escaping from death. Until now, I always just thought they were fools and greedy people. Now I understand. Because, yeah, death, losing your loved ones, whether that be because you're dying or because they're dying, is so hard to bear. And again, I think that is, again, in a lot of these weird vanity things, people would, again, just be seeking immortality because they're evil and want to live forever. But no, in Tolkien, again, even in the appendices, it is understood why they would want to do that. It is understood their fears. And it is not made right. And it is still, sad and bad that they are like that. But it is understandable. And again, that is shown. The fools are understandable. The way in which pride and fear and envy can drive these things is not seen again as good, but it is seen as forgivable. Again, probably some Catholicness there, but I do think it's really important. I do think that's one of the Catholic doctrines that I think is generally applicable. That people do fail, people do screw up, and yes, that's not good. But they shouldn't be written off. They shouldn't be treated as if they can never be good. They can never do anything good. That they are just evil people now. No, it's not that simple. You can always choose at any point, no matter how deeply you have screwed up, no matter how deeply you've committed.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end, congrats! You are officially much stronger than half of our friends. If you are enjoying listening to this podcast, please subscribe to get notified when we update, or follow us on Tumblr at HeyILike, all lowercase. That's all for now. See you next time on Hey, I Like.